Hey everyone, so I basically wanted to kind of mock up the Final Fantasy XIV cross hotbar control system in Godot. So this is that. It's very ugly because I was just focusing on getting kind of the basics working. But yeah, if you're not aware how that works, basically you have these little, I guess, flowers. They correspond to either the D-pad or the face buttons. And so what you can do is you can hold down, in this case, L2, and then it gives you access to, the different buttons, and you can assign abilities to them. And that's how you can kind of play an MMO on a controller. This scheme in particular gives you 32 different actions, which is pretty good. And it works out with Final Fantasy 14 because the global cooldown and whatnot. So yeah, L2 for the left half, R2 for the right half. And there's a couple different configurations. I didn't implement all the different settings. I just went with what I do. And also there's these kind of quote unquote back or extended ones. And the way those work is if you start L2 and then you press R2, it accesses the back left one. And then, vice versa. So it was pretty interesting. I don't think it was too difficult, but I still, learned a couple things about just organizing the code and whatnot. So yeah, that's the control part. I also made a way so you can assign abilities to different slots. So there's the menu over here, and then you just confirm on one of these. It brings you to the assignment mode, and then you just use the same control scheme. And then you can now, use that. Yeah, pretty happy with just how it worked out and different things I learned. So let's go over some of the code. So to start with the kind of smallest unit, the ability. So I implemented the abilities as resources just because I'm not too familiar with the whole resource system. I just wanted to play around with it. Basically, the ability itself has some data, which in this case is just the name and the color of the little icon. And then it has an effect, which in this case I've defined to take in the data of the ability and then a source and a target. And then the ability resource itself basically calls the effect of the ability effect. So this is kind of a overly convoluted way to do it probably. I can be organized a little better, but this is just what I ended up with. It works for just getting an idea of how to put resources together and whatnot. Yeah, and again, because this is just a mock-up, the source is always going to be that player, quote unquote, and the target is always going to be that little label that changes to the element of the ability. So then this itself goes into an ability slot. So the ability slot is structured like this. There's the background color. There's the hotkey label. There's this thing called ability renderer, which just, because the ability itself is a resource, it doesn't have any ability to draw itself, I guess. So the ability renderer, quote unquote, in this case, just takes the color from the ability data and draws that. And then this click indicator is basically if this particular slot gets pressed, it flashes that purpley color to indicate that it was pressed. So yeah, if we look at the code, it's also, I think, fairly straightforward. So I decided to have each ability keep track of its own hotkey. So that's this here. And then basically when this hotkey gets pressed, it sends a signal that itself was pressed, and it also sends up whatever ability was in its slot. That way, the player or the main scene can have access to, the slot, the information about the slot. Besides that, there's just the label, and then the ability in that slot itself, which you saw with the menu assignment method will, that's one way to assign it, or you can do it manually beforehand. Yeah, pretty straightforward. And then the timer is just so that after you click the ability slot, it flashes, and the flash, turns off, so it goes back to normal. Then the ability slots themselves go up to these cross hotbar halves, and this is basically just the 8 slots, 4 for D-pad, 4 for face buttons laid out. There's the only code here is basically to set each slot to be enabled, because the way, if you recall, the way it works is, L2 activates this half, R2 activates this half, etc. So the way to ensure that only the activated half is getting pressed is that each slot keeps track of if it's enabled, basically. And then these cross hotbar halves are assembled into the cross hotbar itself. So I have this background here just to indicate that it's active, and it has the left, the right, back left, back right. In the actual game, Final Fantasy XIV, when you activate the back left, it replaces I think it replaces the entire both sides of these hotbars, because this is the only one active. I just didn't, bother to do that. I just have it all 4 showing. So the cross hotbar, this keeps track of a couple different things. So let's see. Currently active, basically which of these halves is active, to indicate, okay, I should make this bigger so that the player can see this is active, and basically assign the slots in that half to be active. There's this action queue. It's technically not a queue, I just kind of named it like that. This stores the L2 and R2 events, and I'll explain that a little bit later. There's the control state, because if we're in the player control mode, then we want the hotbar to actually press buttons. But if we're in the ability assignment mode, we want to assign the ability to the hotbar slot. And then there's the keeping track of what ability is going to be assigned based on the menu. So there's this, so GUI input, if the activate left or activate right actions are pressed, and these are L2 and R2, then that event gets appended to the action queue, and we only need to keep track of the last 2 presses, because this is basically keeping track of, was L2 pressed first or was R2 pressed first. Then we have the process bar input. So if we release L2 or R2, we want to reset the state. And now the reason we have the queue is that if both L2 and R2 are pressed, again, we need to know the order that they were pressed. So we just check in this queue the most recent press. So I guess technically the queue doesn't need to hold 2 objects. It only needs to hold one, the most recent one. But I think, if I remember correctly, there are maybe some settings where. Actually, no. Yeah, I think technically you only need to check this queue only needs to hold the most recent action. So, that's something that I can fix pretty easily, but it doesn't really matter. Basically, if they're both pressed and the last action was left, that means that R2 was first and then L2. That corresponds to the back right. In Final Fantasy XIV, you can actually set it, I believe, so that order is actually the back left. It's not a huge detail here. It's just one way how it works. And then if it's only one half being pressed, obviously you just activate that half. Otherwise, if nothing is being pressed, then you just reset. If the current state, if a half is active, then this is where the half actually gets scaled up and where the state actually gets set. So basically all this computation before to assign what's active and then actually making it active. And then the reset just, changes the scale down and deactivates the individual slots. Okay, so the cross hotbar itself is part of the player, which just has some placeholder and then the effect text, which is what changes to the name of the ability. So the player code itself, we have the signal ability assignment finished. Basically, if the main scene says, oh, we're in ability assignment mode now, the player changes to ability assignment mode. But then once that assignment finishes, we want to go back to the ability menu. So something needs to tell the main scene that the assignment is finished. That's what that signal's for. The Q and the target, I don't think those are necessary anymore. They're from leftover stuff that I didn't get rid of. The control state, again, this is the main scene will tell the player, are we in player control or are we in ability assignment? And then the player will tell the cross hotbar, because the cross hotbar is part of the player in this case. And then the main scene will also tell the player, this is the ability I want you to assign to this particular slot, because, again, the ability menu is in the main scene. So in the ready function, we're basically getting all of the individual slots of the cross hotbar and connecting those signals, the hotkey press signal, to the player, because when we're casting an ability, we want the ability to know that the player is the source, the one using it. So we need to somehow get that information back up to the player. That's what the signal is for. On hotkey pressed, takes in the ability and the slot itself. So if we're in player control mode, then the ability activates with the player as the source and the effect text as the target, and this is just what changes to the name of the spell to indicate that something happened. If we're in the assignment mode, so basically we came from the ability menu, then again, this on hotkey pressed is a signal that comes from the ability slot, which is passing itself here. So we can just say, okay, slot, your new ability is the one that was given to me to assign to you. So I think it's maybe a little convoluted, but it works. So that's just what I went with. And then, of course, the player has movement. Now, the menu, is also not too complicated. It just has a grid container so that it can display the abilities in an organized manner. And then it has kind of a mock-up cursor. So the ability menu code looks like this. Basically, there's a signal where if you use confirm on a particular ability, the ability menu needs to tell the main scene, okay, I'm ready to assign this ability now. So this is what that's doing. And then we just get all of the abilities and put them into an array, and also put them into the grid container. The array doesn't actually get used, but maybe at some point it could be useful. And basically how this works is, so if the UI accept button is pressed on the ability, as I mentioned, that gets sent to the main scene so that the main scene can tell the player this is the ability you need to assign. Otherwise, it's just navigation. So left or right, we move the index by 1. Up or down, we move the index by the number of columns. So basically, we calculate how much we would need to move the cursor, and then if it would go out of bounds, we cancel that movement, basically. Otherwise, we just update it. So, yeah, not too much going on here. It's mostly the, once we get to the main scene, that's kind of where all the interactions happen. So the main scene, it has that ability menu and it has that player. Also just some text displaying what the state is, an input viewer that lights up so I can, make sure buttons are being pressed. So if you look at what's happening in the main scene is what has the control state, and it passes these control states down to the menu and the player. So that's what the setter is for. So on ready, what it does is it connects some signals. So from the player, it connects the ability assignment finished, because again, once the player is finished assigning an ability, we should return to the menu. We shouldn't be stuck in the ability assignment state. So that's what this on ability assignment finished is for. It just returns the state back to the menu control. And then it also controls a signal. It connects a signal from the ability menu when you have selected, I should probably call this like ability selected or something. When the ability menu has selected something, basically the main scene will get that ability, and then it will be able to send that ability down to the player to tell it, okay, this is the ability you should place in a hotbar. And that's what's happening here. And so, and then there's just some focus changing with the R1, L1 buttons. So I think this is the quote unquote correct way to do things, because basically the player and the menu are kind of at the same level in the tree, so they can't really talk to each other. And you wouldn't want to design them to talk to each other, because then you couldn't test them individually. So basically, when they are doing something important, they are sending a signal up, and then the main scene will handle that signal and basically send the relevant information back down to them. Because I think the common wisdom is that you send signals up the tree, and then you can just kind of directly access if you're going down the tree. I'm pretty happy with how things turned out. There's obviously always more details to optimize and whatnot, but I kind of wanted to have a stopping point. So that's it. Yeah, thanks.